Hello, welcome back. I've made some comments about this in the past, but I think now more than ever, the game desperately needs a difficulty revamp. And I'll try to make this as concise as possible, but this is going to be a little bit of a long one. There's a lot of unused things in the game that could make it really amazing, and a lot of mechanics that people never learn, because the game does a really terrible job intuitively teaching people what works and what doesn't. Especially for new players, there's a lot of myth and mystery behind some of this stuff, which makes the game seem a little more exciting than it really is. And that contrasts sharply with veteran players who are probably bored of doing the same things over and over. And if you watch the video I did about sorry for the bait and switch, but the jelly thing, missions like Pavo, at least on normal and advanced difficulty, the objectives, all they give you is a couple of extra marks. There's no actual failure condition or any real change in the mechanics, and I think that's disappointing. So, first thing, a couple of contextual things before I get into details about how I think a difficulty revamp should be done. Number one, I'm going to focus on level 65 space combat, in particular TFOs. There are difficulty spikes throughout the leveling process, such as the first Romulan D'Deridex or the Vaudouar, but I'm not really talking about those parts of the game. Number two, I don't want to ruin the casual theme park nature of the game. There's a lot of gear that's suboptimal but fun, and you aren't really penalized for using it. That keeps casual players invested, as well as those more interested in the roleplay or space Barbie side of things, and those players should still be able to enjoy the game without getting frustrated. Number three, there are three difficulty settings: normal, advanced, and elite. I don't have the exact metrics, but I'm confident that most players outside of the single player only crowd are playing advanced level TFOs, particularly random advanced TFOs. I'm a member of the largest armada in the game on PC, and I'm regularly active in their chat channels, and I also watch other large channels like NOP Public Service and Reddit Chat. Maybe it's an observational bias, but it seems like the majority of questions about builds and teaming up done in those channels has to do with advanced content, although lately I have seen more random elite teaming too. Number four, some difficulty changes have been done in the past, usually coinciding with a level cap increase. Very early in the game's history, some basic abilities were added, such as ground Borg adapting to weapons, but for the most part, once an NPC enemy is introduced, the set of abilities it comes with is not changed or added to after that. Number five, the last thing I want to talk about is the purpose of DPS as a metric and its usage in the STO community. Of course, there's player-run DPS leaderboards, and measuring DPS in a few select TFOs is a popular way to measure the effectiveness of a build, but that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about your casual, hey, my build does X DPS, how do I make it do 5k more, 10k more, 50k more? I've always thought that the point of DPS testing for most players was to get a measure of how effective a build will be throughout all content in the game. A lot of people don't understand initially that your DPS measurement is going to be very different depending on your team and also what enemies you're up against, even in the same build. So in an effort to standardize the way that people discuss builds, most of the time when people share a build and they note the DPS performance, it's on one of the standard DPS maps like infected space. It's still flawed to some degree based on what your teammates are using, like if they have more debuff, but most people understand how a given build will perform based on its DPS numbers in ISA or ISE. If we check out the STO Better website, you'll see that their DPS numbers are using those maps as well. And then when you use the same build on something like Zenkethi Front, your number is going to be a lot lower because it's a different map, it lasts longer, the enemies are different, etc. In the current state of the game, one of the common pieces of advice is that DPS is survivability, and I also give this advice a lot. It's relatively easy to set up a build that kills everything so quickly that they don't even have a chance to really fire back in both normal and advanced and some elite content. So there's not really much need to have much healing or resistances in the majority of content in the game. Some elites are a little different, requiring a tank to absorb the bulk of the threat for a few minutes. Others require more balanced builds that do like objectives like closing portals and carrying teams like Counterpoint. It's also why people are really shell-shocked when they enter PvP, because the game never really teaches you any kind of long-term survivability, because most PvE combat encounters are only 2 or 3 minutes long. If you're tanking for a run that's particularly slow, maybe you have a better handle on that, but even like your average team that's doing ISE is probably doing it in under 5 minutes. Okay, so a couple of details about how NPC enemies work, and this is kind of the crux of what I would change as far as difficulty. Number one, each NPC faction has different enemies with different types of ships. Borg, for example, have probes, spheres, cubes, tactical cubes, and then special bosses like the assimilated carrier at the end of Cure, or the Borg Queen octahedron at the end of Hive. There are special ships for certain TFOs like assimilated Klingons in the Cure, or nanite spears that repair the Transformers and Infected. But what a lot of people don't know is that those enemies are sometimes different depending on the TFO that they're in, even though they're named the same. I've been working on this video for a really long time, so I'm going to use some old screenshots here, but the Borg Tactical Cube in Infected Space has a lot more HP than the ones in Hive Onslaught, even though they have the same entity name. Okay, second thing, NPCs have abilities like a player ship, but they use them without any logic applied besides if they are in combat and if they have an enemy targeted. So basically, NPCs never pre-buff or do anything like save an ability for the right moment like a player would. For example, a Borg cube with tractor beam will use the tractor beam on the nearest threatening target the very moment it becomes available. And this can either be right at the start of combat, or if the cube survives long enough and it comes off cooldown, they'll use it again as soon as it's off cooldown. I don't know if the cooldown timers on NPC abilities are different than players, but it's generally assumed to be the same. Back when the Tribble test server was up, I measured the cooldowns of various NPC abilities, such as the Alachi using Torpedo High Yield, and they would use it again after exactly 30 seconds, but since I don't have access to the code, I can't confirm that everything in the game works this way. Also, enemies are capable of using the same abilities as universal consoles that players can, but they don't actually have the console equipped, so they won't have the passives, just the active ability from it. For example, the Borg Queen sometimes uses isometric charge or antimatter spread. Third, and this one is absolutely critical, NPCs have no skill points at all. So they don't have any control or any drain, and no weapons specialization or amplification or particle generator or anything like that at all. That means that if you gave an NPC Gravity Well 3, which can expand up to 12 kilometers and do a pretty good amount of damage with a player using it with high control and high EPG skill, the NPC using the same rank skill will be a lot less effective in terms of pull strength and damage, because nothing is actually enhancing that ability. It'd be the equivalent to if you made a new character and just wiped out your skill tree and had no endeavors or anything, and equipped Gravity Well 3 and then used it that way. That also means that they don't have any armor, consoles, set bonuses, or other equipment. I've seen a lot of bad info on this lately, but resistances can go negative, so that's how most DPS runs work. If the NPCs have 0% resistance, you're able to reduce their resistances into negative values. Number 4, NPCs are configured for different difficulties in mainly 2 ways. The first is the type of enemy placed at the spawn location, such as a tactical cube replacing a standard cube at the start of Infected, or a tactical cube replacing an assimilator, or whatever it is now. The second is their HP value. An elite version of an enemy has more HP and stays alive longer, making them harder to fight because it takes longer to kill them because they can shoot back at you more. I also spent a lot of time testing this with higher level enemies, and they do deal slightly higher base damage. However, they use the same skills, so sticking with the Tactical Cube example, it uses High Yield Torpedo 3 and Fire at Will 3 at any difficulty setting that it spawns in. So here's what I'd like to see in a difficulty revamp. The difficulty levels should be differentiated by more than just the HP pool. Instead, the abilities they use should change and go up in rank and effectiveness. This could be assigned to each enemy with a buff, just like the way it works on the Tribble server test map. When that was up, I was going to show it, but Tribble server is down, or to the entity itself. Normal difficulty should stay roughly the same. Enemies only have a few abilities, normal HP, no failure conditions, but also add the elite marks like the Borg neural processors or discovery canisters to the reward pool. That will help more casual players by giving them the resources to earn better gear to then participate in advanced and elite content. This is what casual players in the game should be playing after my proposed revamp instead of advanced. They aren't being penalized by doing so because they're still getting the same rewards. Advanced difficulty should add multiple additional abilities to each class of NPC, as well as an HP increase, but not a huge one like we currently see in the game. This would promote more balanced builds and could encourage people to modify or specialize their builds to combat different enemies. Players would learn the negative effects of an enemy debuff and what can be used to clear it. For example, Borg used tractor beams, and I think a lot of people know that polarized hull makes you immune to a tractor beam. So if you queue for a Borg TFO, it might be worth bringing polarized hull along. But say you queue against Voth, and Voth used subnucleonic beam. Instead of polarized hull, you can simply swap in Science Team when you're ready to launch into that TFO. This should be common practice already, especially because right now you're able to switch what officers have in their slots by just a couple of clicks. I actually remember a time when you trained a buff in whatever abilities they had, and if you wanted different abilities, you had to go all the way back to the trainer on Earth Space Dock and replace them. In addition, give NPCs the occasional defensive ability. Maybe Borg cubes occasionally use Ox to Sift for the heal and resistance. Most of these enemies would use buff skills only. I'd like to see the specializations added to enemies that existed in the T5 era that didn't have specializations. For example, Iconians came out after T6, so they use intel abilities, and we all kind of expect that. Borg, however, existed before specializations did, so they've never been updated, and they use the same basic engineering, science, and tactical abilities only. Elite difficulty would take it a step even further. A slight HP increase over advanced, but not as much as we're seeing now, where a tactical cube has 1.7 million hull on advanced and 8 million hull in elite, which is a huge difference. In addition, give them both abilities and increase the ranks by a step or two. So for example, if an enemy had Torpedo Spread 1 on Advanced, give them Torpedo Spread 2 in Elite, and so on. Then, and this is a crazy one, give them access to a few Starship traits or Universal Console abilities or both, especially boss NPCs. Each faction of NPCs could get a different and unique variation on what builds are best to fight them. It would also make some of the more unique mechanics we really only get to use in PvP useful in PvE. For example, it's not uncommon in PvP to use something like the Ablative Corruption, which prevents someone from healing or regenerating hull for 15 seconds. But that's never really useful in PvE because the enemies don't really regenerate hull or heal in the same way. It's a really cool mechanic that's not utilized anywhere else in the game, and it would be nice if it was in PvE. And critically, across all difficulty levels, reduce the number of enemy ships. It isn't really exciting to blow up 20 Borg spheres in the span of a few seconds. The game would be more fun with fewer, stronger enemies. Maybe certain factions like Herc could continue to do the swarm of many ship thing, which would make them unique to fight against, but it seems like every TFO is a massive war crime or something with thousands of ships blowing up. I've made a spreadsheet about how I think this should work, and I'll put it in the description. I intended to fill out every faction of enemies, but that's a lot of work, and I don't get paid for this, so I'm just kind of getting the ball rolling here and talking through it, and let's face it, it's a dream anyway, so. But let's go through, I did do Borg, so here's how it would work, basically. All enemies, I've separated on the left-hand side. You have the different types of Borg ships, and this is how they're currently set up on the left. Borg Probe, Borg Sphere, Borg Cube, and these are the abilities that they currently have. And then on the right is the abilities that I think they should have. And in addition, they'll also have a passive skill buff. So for example, Borg on normal only have minor resistances to a couple of different things and a little bit of extra projectile damage. And then you go and you look at what abilities they have, and a probe just has boarding party. A sphere has beam overload 1 and emergency power to engines 3, but otherwise it's pretty similar to the original. Borg cubes get high yield 1 and boarding party, tractor beam and tachyon beam, so on and so forth. But then, and let's just focus on the cube. By advanced, they're up to high yield 2. They also gain emergency power to shields and exceed rated limits. Tractor beam is upgraded and tachyon beam is upgraded. And then on elite difficulty, a Borg cube would use high yield 3, boarding party, emergency power to shields 3, engineering team 2 to heal itself, exceed rated limits for larger single target damage, align shield frequencies, which heals the shields of the cube itself as well as surrounding enemies, tractor beam 3 and tachyon beam 3, and then the special Borg ability, shield neutralizer, which it has at all ranks. So fighting a Borg cube would ramp up slowly, and you'd start to understand how to combat it by moving up from normal to advanced, and then advanced to elite. And then the skill buffs also change. So like on advanced, Borg resist phasers, disruptors, and plasma because that's what the Alpha Quadrant species use, and that's who they've been fighting a lot. But they don't resist Polaron, Tetron, or Antiproton as much because the Borg haven't really encountered Jem'Hadar or Tholians, and the anti-proton weapons, canonically, at least within the STO universe, are the anti-Borg weapons, so they should be the most effective against them. And then a couple of other things like that. Subsystem offline, a little extra control, a little extra projectile weapons. And then by elite, they're resisting that stuff a lot. So suddenly, the best build to fight Borg might be anti-proton, or maybe fire, cold, proton, drain, EPG, right? So some combination of those things fights Borg. But then if I look at, like, here's my kind of working list for other factions. Borg are weak to anti-proton and drain, right? If you're fighting Tholians, they're weak to phasers, but strong against drain and Tetrion. If you're fighting Voth, they're weak to plasma and control, but strong against, I guess I can't put that. Strong against drain and anti-proton. So a drain anti-proton build that is great against Borg is then weak against Voth. And all of a sudden, all the build discussions that we have as a community are more dynamic. Because right now, the discussions are basically like, does item A do more damage than B? If A does more damage, then use A. And it's that simple. And it's really a shame because it could be a lot more exciting than that. And then the other thing I wanted to mention is I'm going to use the assimilated carrier at the end of Cure Found as my example for this one. The Cure Found assimilated carrier, right now it uses torpedo, high yield, and torpedo spread and tractor beam, and then it has a couple of hanger pets, right? That's all it uses. And that is the boss. So even on elite difficulty, that's all it uses. Imagine if on normal it's got Eng team, so it heals. All of a sudden, you're slowly being introduced. Okay, enemies, none of the other enemies heal. Spheres, probes, cubes, whatever, except for the boss. So if you're playing on normal difficulty and you see it use engineering team, you're like, oh, okay, some enemies can heal, and you learn that mechanic. Then when you move up to advanced and Borg cubes are using Eng team and, well, that's the only one at the moment, but the cubes start using Eng team as well, you are more prepared for that. And then by the time you get to elite and they're healing, you're prepared for that because you know what to expect. You're used to them doing that kind of thing. But the boss, basically by advance, has everything upgraded, but adds fire at will, photonic officer, and concentrate firepower to help its pet damage. And then by elite, it's using concentrate firepower 3 as well as superior area denial. So the pets are suddenly a lot more dangerous to fight against. This is a true boss fight because superior area denial, for those of you who don't PvP, superior area denial can be cleared with tactical team. So if the assimilated carrier is shooting you and debuffing you with superior area denial and marking you with concentrate firepower, then you can stop that from happening by using tactical team. So maybe the build that you use to fight the elite carrier, now you're using anti-proton, drain, tactical team. But again, the build that you fight the Voth Citadel ship at the end of that one, if you use the same build that you use for this, it's going to be really ineffective because the Voth are strong against anti-proton drains, and maybe they don't use anything that you need tactical team for. So if you imagine that extrapolated throughout the whole game, it would be really, really awesome to theorize and discuss what the best builds are to use in different TFOs and against different enemies. And Advance would be a proper challenge, but still has some training wheels and basically help everyone what to do and prepare them for Elite. So I also think my sort of motivation behind this is I think that the transition to then getting into PvP would be a little less insurmountable. I think one of the main reasons why PvP isn't popular, besides the obvious stuff like there's no rewards, no dilithium or marks or anything, but it's like a whiplash effect. You spend the whole game, thousands of hours, doing nothing but increasing damage and killing multiple enemies as quickly as possible. So you get to PvP, and suddenly you have to worry about healing and resistances and dealing damage to a single target, as well as the reverse of that is getting debuffed and clearing it off of yourself. So most people never really adapt to that change because they don't know what to expect. All right, one last point about the TFO design, and I'll call this map hazards or map design. In addition to the abilities and more interesting kind of combat that I'm describing, I would like to see more interesting thing regarding the actual spaces that we fight in. There are a few standouts, such as the breach or To Hell with Honor, but for the most part, it's just big empty space. I think it would be cool if they did a few things with hazards, kind of like there's a nebula in Vault and Snare that disables your shields while you're within it. It doesn't have to be that extreme, but a couple of TFOs that use map hazards like that would make combat feel a little bit more like we're not just in a huge vacuum, even if that's probably realistic, and it might feel a little bit more like Star Trek. I feel like every episode of Star Trek involves some kind of combat with the additional hazard of whatever region of space they're in, especially like Voyager is my favorite show, and it's always like, oh, we're in a nebula and we can't fire torpedoes. How do we beat this enemy or whatever? That kind of thing. I really hate this mission, but there's another one. In Operation Gamma, when you fly inside a bunch of asteroids and it's really, really like tight and claustrophobic to complete some objectives, I think it would be really cool to have a TFO like that where you have to actually maneuver around a really tight asteroid field. I know they've done a few things like this before, like Undyne Assault has fluidic space, or Gravity Kills will pull you into the, event horizon and blow you up. And I really like those, and I'd like to see more of that because it makes those TFOs feel more unique. So, in conclusion, here's a result of what the changes would be. Players would be able to play normal difficulty without being penalized in terms of rewards, and then continue to have no failure conditions, and any kind of build will work well enough kind of freedom that we expect from the game now. Advanced and Elite would be more difficult than they are now, and the builds would become more specialized to deal with those scenarios, but not in the way that current Elite builds are specialized with damage alone at the forefront. Instead, builds would be specialized based on what faction of enemies or which map the combat is going to take place on. Combat would feel more like Star Trek, with each enemy defeat feeling more like an accomplishment, and the game will have more intuitive difficulty curve rather than the huge wall that it is currently going from Advanced to Elite to PvP. Build discussions would also be more dynamic, less is A better than B kind of discussions, and it would involve a lot more like what map are you on, what enemies are you fighting, and what situations are you in on the map. That's all I have, and I'll intersperse some sample footage throughout this video. Thank you for watching, and have a good one.